So welcome everyone to the session today on grant applications. My name is Gillian Matthews. I'll be your host for this journey. I am the Inspiring the ACT manager, and I'm also a member of the Canberra branch for the Australian Science Communicators, who are both hosting this event today. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that I'm meeting on, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And I would love all of you to start sharing in the chat what country you're signing in from today, and take a moment to think about the traditional owners of those lands that you're signing in from. It's always interesting to see where everyone's from. Being online, we can be across the country. Don't think we've got international, but who knows? So this session today is part of the Australian Science Communicators and Inspiring ACT Small Scale Big Impact series. We've got, I think, about 7 in the series now that have been co-delivered by ASC and Inspiring the ACT on a variety of different topics that are supposed to support and help event coordinators, science communicators, those sorts of people working in this science engagement arena. So it is professional learning support with core event management skills, and those resources can be found through the Inspiring ACT website, which I will share the link in the chat in a little bit, and through the Australian Science Communicators YouTube channel as well. So they're the 2 places. So it is currently in 2 locations. We will bring it all into 1 location. So that's what the series is part of. So today the presentation's on the brilliant basics of grant applications. Please note we are recording this session, so you are welcome to leave your camera on. If you choose not to, that's also up to you. Just so you're aware, this will be recorded and we will be sharing it sort of as the same as we have the previous one. So it is a resource that you can come back to if you're like, oh, what was that? It will be here. And available for you. So it will go up on the ASC Canberra YouTube channel. And like I said, I'll share those links in a minute. We will have a chance at the end of the presentation to ask questions. You can do this through submitting them through the chat function, but also use the chat function to interact amongst yourselves. So Alice, we have here to share some knowledge, but she's not the only person with knowledge on grants in the world. So I'm sure some of you have some insights as well. So as we're going, feel free to use that chat to share amongst yourselves. If you do have any technical issues, please post those in the chat. I'll be monitoring that and I can do my best to assist you, but sometimes it's hard from afar. So today we are joined by Alice Ryder. Alice is a science communicator and a self-described public programming nerd. She's worked around Australia in science engagement for nearly 20 years. She redeveloped and ran major event grants for the Northern Territory government with a budget of nearly $1.8 million and advised on event development. Alice has also sat on assessment panels for National Science Week grants, both national and state funded grants, and has received multiple ACT National Science Week grants. She'll be a cheerleader for your event idea and help you to hopefully develop some skills and give you some tips and tricks that she's learned along her journey working in this sort of grant arena. So I will hand over to Alice now. And yeah, off you go, Alice.
Great, thanks so much, Jill. Good evening, everybody. Can everyone hear me okay? If I can just get some thumbs up. Beautiful. And can everyone see a slide that says Grant Applications Brilliant Basics? Oh, well then we are halfway home and hosed already. I've called this talk Brilliant Basics. I feel like the term basic has been sort of has perhaps evolved and changed and become a bit of a disparaging word in some contexts, in some places. Oh, you're basic. It's just basic. But I think basics are really important as foundations to build skills and build ideas from. So we're going to be talking about grant applications in general today, and then talking about the National Science Week grants as a bit of a case study. I will start off with some sort of simple things, and it may be that you go, Alice, I've thought of this stuff already. Pfft, what are you talking about? But I do consciously want to take things from the beginning. As Julie Andrews, one of my favorite ladies, would say, we'll start at the beginning and we'll move our way along from there. So hopefully we will warm up as the talk goes on, and there might be some useful takeaways if you're looking at applying for grants in the future. Oh, please go forward. Pretty please. I know that Jill has already done this, but I would like to also acknowledge country. I'm also on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land in Canberra. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that, you know, the land I live on here has been inhabited for thousands of years by people who have held amazing events and ceremonies and celebrations for many thousands of years, and people who've practiced science in all its myriad forms for thousands of years. And I just wanted to share a few photos of some of my favourite spots around Canberra that you can explore and visit and see that enduring connection to country over thousands and thousands of years. Today, I want to take you through and give you a little bit of an insight into what it's like to be a grant assessor. As Jill mentioned, I've assessed a number of different types of grants in different contexts. And in explaining what it's like to be a grant assessor, I'm hoping that I can give you some tips about how to make the life of grant assessors easier. If they are happy and joyful, they're a lot more likely to give you money. So we'll talk about what it's like to be a grant assessor. I'll give you some general grant application tips. And then, as I said, we'll dive into using the National Science Week National Grant Round as a case study. My understanding is that that's a grant round that many of you may be interested in. But if you are not interested in that right now, that's okay. The general tips are applicable no matter what area you are working in. Jill kind of pretty much explained who I am, so I won't dwell on this for too long to sort of explain why am I the person doing this talk. But as Jill said, my background is in science communication. I've worked in lots of different places around Australia, for Landcare, for Questacon, for the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, for the WA Museum. But I took a little side jaunt in my career up to the Northern Territory, left science behind for a little while, and ran major events funding for the Northern Territory government for 2 years. One of the major things that you discover running grants in the Northern Territory is you get very, very wet in the wet season. Trying to run events anytime between about now and May means that you'll get very, very soggy, but they are worth persevering through anyway. And I have also run a number of events for National Science Week myself. One many, many years ago that was a little touring program that went to deeply exotic locales like Bega and Merimbula and Cooma, talking about the history of science and how ideas evolve. And much more recently, to sort of put a very different hat on for National Science Week, this year I ran an event called the Sex on the Beach Science Show, which pretty much did what it said on the tin. It explored animal reproduction in a very light-hearted and quirky and silly way. And I got to make a blue whale condom as one of my favourite props. So let's get started. Being a grant assessor, I find really interesting for about the first hour, and then it can become pretty exhausting. When I assessed the National Science Week grants, they were all printed out, and no joke, the folder of paper was about this thick. It needed not a regular sized ring binder, it needed a big ring binder. There were well over 100 applications. And after not too long, they start to all sound very, very similar. The grants that you assess as a grant assessor in any sort of grant round generally are quite mixed in quality. And you might be asked to assess grants about events that are about a topic that you yourself don't know a lot about. So my background is in environmental science. I love landscapes and landscape processes, how rocks and animals and plants interact to create landscapes and functionality. But in assessing the National Science Week grants, I was also assessing events about health science and about physics, which are things that I don't know a great deal about. And that's pretty normal for grant assessors. We'll come back to that in a minute. But while they are smart and awesome and clever people, they won't necessarily know a great deal about the specifics of what your grant or event is about. So make life easier for them. Usually what happens is that grant assessors will read through their big pile of grants individually and do their own ratings, give their own sort of scores out of 10 or scores out of 100, however the rubric has been set up. And then they'll come together either physically or virtually to compare and contrast scores and discuss each application on its merits. Usually, but not always, when the people come together, you'll find there's a fair bit of consensus about the applications that really did not fit the remit, so are very unlikely to get funded. And there's also usually pretty good consensus about the ones that absolutely nailed it. The debate usually happens around the middle, those border cases of which grants should make the final cut. So that's what grant assessors are doing when they're exploring their day. They're having a lot of coffee, they're reading things that start to sound repetitive, they're trying to remember which grant is what. When I was assessing the National Science Week grants, I had a little spreadsheet, and at the end I was writing myself notes to remember what was what. I must confess, in a very informal way. Things like, oh, this is the one about sheep. I like sheep. Or I don't know what this person's going on about. This is really confusing. I didn't realize when I submitted my ratings that column actually traveled with it. So all of the other assessors had a very good laugh at my very informal notes to myself. So that's a good learning. Make sure you think about what you're sharing with other people. But at the end of that assessment process, when everybody gets together and discusses their ratings of different events, generally the panel hopes to come up with a list of events that does a number of things. In this context, I'm talking about for National Science Week, but this actually applies to most grant rounds, especially on a national scale. They're looking for a suite of events that have a high chance of success. So we want low risk events. If we're spending money, we really, really hope that the event will actually go ahead, and will go ahead pretty much as was promised. So that it will go ahead both in terms of actually happening and that it attracts the audience that it says it will attract. You know, generally grant programs exist to try to make the world a better place in some way or another, whether that's to encourage young people to engage with science, or whether that's to encourage tourists to come to the Northern Territory and see what a wonderful place it is. So we want events that we think will actually make a difference in the world and make the world a bit of a better place and meet the aims of the funding program. We want events that represent value for money, especially in a government context. It's really important that government money is being spent wisely. And there's a great deal of sort of review and consideration of the way that government funds are spent, because they are always increasingly tighter and tighter. And another really important thing is that as part of the suite events that get funded, the panel are hoping to have events that attract media attention so that we can get the word out about the suite of events that's happening, whether that's National Science Week as a phenomenon or whether that's something else. So they want to have some events that are going to be big and flashy or quirky or sort of tug on your heartstrings and really meaningful and tell a nice story. We want to engage diverse audiences with our range of events, and generally we aim to have a good geographic spread across the country. So we'll come back to these things when we look at our case study for National Science Week specifically, but this is the sort of universe that we want to end up with. One event is not going to cover off on all of these things, but on balance, we want to create a patchwork of events that fulfill all of these goals or ambitions. So before I jump into National Science Week specifically, I want to talk about 6 basics of grant applications. As I said at the beginning, some of these might sound really simple and really obvious, but I promise you, from experience, having read those piles of grants like this, and for the Northern Territory government, it was similar. They were big, fat piles of grants applications. If you follow these 6 really basic tips, you'll be ahead of about 1/3 of applicants straight away. So they are worth thinking about. If people want to come off mute, does anyone want to take a guess for a moment at one of the really basic things to think about when applying for a grant? One of the really basic things I might encourage you to do.
Tell them what the grant's about. Make it exciting, make it amazing, capture their interest in that opening sentence.
Indeed, make it exciting and make it amazing is absolutely one of the things that I would encourage you to do. Any other guesses?
Tailor what you've written for the specific grant rather than just generic.
Very much so. So you might think about that as like answer the actual question that's being asked. Very much. Often people don't do that. You'd be surprised how often they don't actually answer the question properly and tailor it to the context. 1 or 2 other guesses? You're nailing it so far.
Tell them how much money you want, tell them what you're going to do with the money and how you prove what you did with the money and why it was a success.
Yes, they are all excellent things. Let's have one more guess if anyone else wants to share, and then we'll dive into these steps one at a time.
To be consistent and make sure you've covered off everything mentioned in the budget so they know exactly where their money's going and you've covered all your bases.
Yeah, beautiful. Absolutely. We'll talk about budgets a little bit more later, but it is really important that your budget is reasonable and accurate. So that does indeed fold into one of the things that I want to talk about. Thank you all so much for your thoughts. The way that I would divide these basics up are as follows. First of all, read all the instructions before you start. And I know that sounds really obvious, but if you open up the National Science Week instructions, they're quite long. I started writing this talk and I went, well, I better follow my own instructions and read all the instructions. I started writing the talk, then the cheeky so-and-so's released new guidelines, so I had to read them all again. But they are quite long. They're about 20 pages for one document, and then there's a sample guidelines that's another 15 or 20 pages. So it can look a bit overwhelming, and a lot of the text can sometimes feel very governmenty and formal and sort of a bit, when you start reading it, you go, oh, this is too complicated. I just want to get in and talk about my event. But really read all of the instructions and guidelines before you start. It's really, really critical. And we'll talk about these more in a minute. Then answer the actual questions that are being asked. Write clearly. Get a feel for the sorts of events that have received funding in the past. So have a look at the ecosystem of funding that you're working with and get some inspiration to think, does my event feel like it belongs in that ecosystem or that universe of other events that have been funded? Or is it something really different? If it's wildly different, maybe this isn't the right grant round for you, or maybe you just need to pitch your event a little bit differently. Don't try to trick the grant assessors. That relates to budgets, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And finally, as was mentioned first, make your application interesting. Make it stand out. As I said, you start to fall asleep, all the applications start to sound the same. So make your application something that's going to wake someone up after they've had, 10 or 20 applications and they're dying for a coffee. Make yours stand out so that people pay attention. So we'll talk about these in a bit more detail. When you're reading the instructions, check your eligibility, both as a person or an organisation, and the eligibility of the event you want to run. They're two different things, but they're both really important. You may personally be eligible for a grant, but the activity you're proposing might not be, or vice versa. Check all the closing dates and aim to finish your application the day before at least the applications close. Now, I must confess, I have not always followed these instructions myself. So I should be very careful about, talking about things that I have not always nailed. I have once or twice forgotten that the grants were due and then written things in a hurry the night before, but that is far from ideal. So do your best to check the closing dates and stick to them. Small grant rounds do often extend their closing dates, but don't rely on that. And just because a grant round extended their closing date last year doesn't necessarily mean they'll do it this year. And finally, check your obligations as you're reading through all of these instructions and think about whether you're really prepared to meet what the grant requires. So that includes things like tracking expenditure, doing evaluation. Are you really, really prepared, and do you have the time to meet what is expected of you? If the answer is no, that's okay. If the answer is yes, that's cool, but factor in enough time to do that job. So at this point, once you've read everything, I'd really encourage you to stop and think. Go away, make a cup of tea, have a gin and tonic, eat a Kit Kat, do whatever helps you sort of get in the zone, sit in the sunshine for 10 minutes. And before you start writing your application, having read all the instructions and thought about all the obligations, think about if you really want to apply for this grant right now, and if you really want to run your event right now in the context that will be required for the grant. Think about the pros and cons, or the costs and benefits. So consider your time, don't just think about, okay, well, I reckon it's going to take about, 20 hours of my life to organise, and then I'm going to go on the road for 3 or 4 nights. So I'll need 3 or 4 nights of my life. That's important. But also think about the opportunity cost of that time. What else could you be doing with 20 hours and 3 or 4 days? Could you be volunteering at Vinnie's? Could you be spending quality time with your dog? Could you be resting and taking care of your own mental health? So think about the cost of your time. Think about the cost of out-of-pocket expenses. Even if you do get a grant to help with an event, very, very often you will end up incurring some costs yourself. Consider the time of helpers and other people involved in the project. I was very lucky for the Sex on the Beach science show that my sister helped me with some graphic design. I am terrible at graphic design. She's great, but it took a hunk of her time to help me. So think about the other people you're relying on, and also take a moment and think about how you would feel if you put heaps of time into organising this event, writing your grant application, booking in the venues, preparing your show, doing advertising, and then not many people came. Hopefully your event will be amazing and awesome, and it probably will be, but it is worth thinking about how you would feel and what would happen if you put this effort in and it might not play out how you think it will. Then on the other hand, think about the benefits. Running events is awesome, You can make a difference to the community. You can learn new skills. You can do something you're really proud of and that brings you joy. It might be something that you want to add to your CV in terms of demonstrating skills in terms of event development and organisation. And you might meet new people and build networks. But I do really, really encourage you to have a proper think about whether applying for a grant, this particular grant right now, is something that you want to do, and running your proposed event at this time and in this context is something that you want to do. There will always be times in the future when you can do your event in another way if the costs and benefits aren't quite adding up for you at the moment. And the last thing I would say is, honestly, I have never, ever, ever heard anyone come out and say, wow, that event took less time than I thought it would to plan and implement. So however long you think it's going to take, up it by 30% in your brain at least, and check that you're still prepared to go ahead with it. So I don't want to be a negative Nelly. I don't want to scare you off, but I do really encourage you to think about whether running an event and applying for a grant is the right thing for you at this particular time. If it is, awesome, then go forward and do it joyfully and with as much enthusiasm as you can muster. The next thing I want to say, I think this is actually probably the biggest thing that I wish people did, is answer the actual questions that are asked in the grant application and answer all of them. And this comes to something that someone mentioned when they were brainstorming things about tailoring your grant to this particular grant that you're doing. If you have an event that you want to run, that you might have applied for grant funding in 3 or 4 different places for 3 or 4 years, don't just copy paste stuff and dump it into a document. Really clearly read the question and answer the actual questions that are being asked. If you are applying for funding to run an event in the Northern Territory that will bring tourists to the Northern Territory, don't write about how nice the event is for locals. Write about how it will actually bring tourists to the Northern Territory. If you are asked for National Science Week to write about your capacity and your capability to do the event, so do you have the right skills to do this event? Don't write a history of your organisation and how it was founded in 1910 and has included many preeminent scientists. Say, this is me, this is my skill set, these are my networks, this is how I'm going to make the event a success. Honestly, 1/4 to 1/3 of the event applications I've read haven't properly answered the question. So if you can do that, you are leapfrogging ahead of 1/4 of the other applicants straight away by just doing that. Relatedly, write clearly. Check the character limits or the word limits of applications before you start to draft your responses. Often grants, including National Science Week, will have sort of a template for a grant application or a dummy grant application. It tells you what the character limit is. That will really help you craft your writing to make sure that you don't write a beautiful essay and then realize you're actually only allowed 1 paragraph of a response. When you're writing, really focus on the why should I care or why does this matter? It needs to be super clear to the person reading the application what difference your event is going to make in the world. Why does the event matter and why should they care about it? And as I said before, my background's in environmental science, but I was reading grant applications about health events. I don't know a lot of health jargon. So when you're writing, imagine that you are writing to someone who is smart and awesome, but is not necessarily an expert in the content that you are talking about. Then basic things, but honestly, it makes a difference. Get someone else to proofread your application. Pick someone who is smart, but not an expert in your thing. Maybe that's your mum. Maybe it's your housemate. Maybe it's your neighbour. And if you have prepared well and you've written your application a few days before it's due, leave it for a day, come back and proofread it again. Where, as grant assessors, we're not going to fail you and not give you funding if there's a typo, but if it's easy to read and clear, oh my gosh, it is so much easier to mark well. You're in a better mood when you're reading it, and it's human nature that when we're in a good mood, we are slightly more generous with our marking. Then what I would really encourage you to do, and I've broken this down a little bit for National Science Week later on, is have a look at the universe or the ecosystem that you're playing in. Look at events that have got funding previously through these grant rounds. Look at what sort of language they're using to describe their events. Look at what sort of audiences they're targeting. Look at what makes them similar and what makes them different. And you want to feel like your event fits broadly within that ecosystem, but offers something a little bit unique and different. If it's way off to the side, maybe this isn't the right grant round for you. If it's a little bit left of field, that might be great. It might grab the grant assessor's attention, but make sure it still feels consistent with the universe that it's working in. And link the reading that you're doing from the successful grant applicants back to the reading you did at the beginning about the instructions with the grants. You should see some really, really clear links. I'm happy to share these slides with you later. I've put a link down the bottom here to the grant round recipients for 2022 for National Science Week. So that's a great spot to start your reading. And then don't try to be cheeky. I was tempted to write, don't be a wanker for write clearly, and don't be a dickhead for this slide, but I think that's maybe a bit cheeky. So instead I've said, don't try to trick the grant assessors. Don't try to pull the wool over their eyes. People who are chosen to assess grants like the National Science Week grants or events in the Northern Territory or events elsewhere are people who've worked in the industry themselves for quite a long time. I know I have a baby face, but I'm older than I look, and I've worked in the industry for nearly 20 years when I added up, which really frightens me as much as anybody else. And I was one of the younger and more junior people on the grant assessments for National Science Week. So you've got a bunch of really clever people who've run events themselves, and that means they've got a really good internal metal detector for things that are a bit dodgy. So be honest about your budget. Don't inflate your budget in funny ways to try to get slash funds. People will pick it up really quickly. And also be honest about your intended audience numbers. If you think that you're going to bring 1,000 people along to an event that you're doing in a tiny, tiny community, we might go, that's interesting. I wonder where they got the number 1,000 from. So be honest in your budget, and be honest and clear in your ambitions. And it's really worth noting from the website that for the National Science Week grants, the maximum amount that you can bid for is $20,000. If you ask for $20,000 straight away, all those sensors are going to be like triply sparkling to go, ooh, you're asking for a lot. Are you sure that you need it? And are you sure that you're going to give us value for money for that $20,000? So be extra, extra careful. The more money you ask for, the more rigor you need to justify where that money is going and why it is valuable and the difference it's going to make. And finally, make it stand out. Wake the poor person up who's just read 20 applications and is sort of daydreaming about a coffee and a banana for their morning tea. Show your passion for your topic and your event. You're allowed to have feelings. You're allowed to be excited. Excitement is infectious. And write a pitch right at the beginning that will capture the grant assessor's attention. A great way to do that is to share some of the cool things that you'll explain or you'll explore in your event. So give people a taste of what the audience might experience. You want to try to make the grant assessor feel like either I want to go to this event, or if it's not targeted at me, someone I know. Like if it's an event targeted at seniors, you should make me feel like, oh, I want to tell my granddad to go to this event. If it's an event targeted at toddlers, you want to make me feel like, oh, I want to tell my friend Jill that she should take her toddler to that event. So you want to enthuse people and also show them what's going to make your event special and different to other events. Show off your unique selling point. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So I'm not saying that this is perfect, but as an example, I'll read you the first 2 sentences of the pitch for the event that I ran recently. I said, what happens when you combine David Attenborough's gravitas with Barry White's sex appeal and a giant vat of slime? You get the sex on the beach science show. And then afterwards, I talked about some of the things people might see in the show that I thought were particularly exciting. I said that there would be a flatworm penis fencing competition, that you would learn how human snogging relates to shark sex. So hopefully when someone's reading that grant, it might not be an area of personal interest, but at the very least they'll go, oh, okay, this sounds interesting. I think I'll pay attention and I'll read some more. So show what you love and give people a taster of what they're going to get. Having run through in quick succession those 6 basic tips, as I said, that's going to get you ahead of at least 1/3 of the other applicants. I do now want to dive into talking about the National Science Week national grants in a little bit more detail, and in some cases refer back to those things we said earlier and how you can apply them in this particular context. But having said that, I need a big flashing red light. This is general advice only, as they like to say on ads. If you have a specific question about the National Science Week grants, please contact the people who run them. I'm not assessing them this year. I do not run these grants. I've put a link down the bottom here to where you reach out. You can email or call, and they are very happy to give you specific advice. So having had that big red flashing light, let's dive in. Hopefully most of you are familiar with National Science Week. In 2023, it's going to be held from the 12th to the 20th of August. And for the National Science Week grants, there's a pool of $500,000 available for events. The minimum amount you can apply for is $2,000. The maximum amount is $20,000. As I said before, if you apply for $20,000, you better have a real ripper of an event and extremely good evidence that you are going to pull your event off and that it's going to make a big difference. The grants are open right now. They close on the 15th of December. The success, which is later than normal. So usually the events are open a little bit earlier than this. Forecasting ahead, my best guess is that successful applicants will probably be told that they've been successful in around about April. It's worth noting that April's not an awfully long time before August. The school's theme for National Science Week in 2023 is innovation, powering future industries, but you don't have to follow the school's theme for your event. If you want to, you can. If you're a school, you would follow this particular theme, or you can choose to follow the theme. But for this grant round, you do not have to follow that theme if you don't want to. I'm not going to read it out loud over here, but also when you read the instructions, you will see the objectives of the grant opportunity. And these are really, really critical to think about. Does my event fit these objectives? As I mentioned, April's not an awfully long time before August. So another stop and think moment. You've gone and had one cup of tea and a Kit Kat and a gin and whatever else. Stop and have another cup of tea and think, okay, if I'm going to find out I've got my event in April, do I have time to get things organized and make my event happen by August? Keep in mind that the room you want to book might already have been booked by some other event by that point in time. So you might need to do extra work to find an available venue. Think about, do I have time to promote my event? Am I giving my work, my day job enough notice to take time and leave in August if I only find out if my event's been successful in April? Do I have time to make all the collateral and do all the preparation? So that is going to be a particular challenge this year, is that the turnaround time for events is going to be a bit tighter than normal. You can start planning and hope that you will get the funding and make it go ahead, but the funders cannot pay for things that you have paid for already before your grant deed is signed. So if you pay to hire the Cootamundra RSL Bistro Hall room in January, and then you find out you've got your event in April, and then you sign your paperwork in late April, they can't back pay you for the hire of an RSL hall that you already paid for before. So that's a really important thing to have a stop and think about. There's a few important notes about eligibility. Again, read the instructions, please, because this is not all of the things that are important for eligibility, but these are a few things that when I've assessed the grants, I've seen people get tripped up on. So a few things that I think are worth calling out. In order to apply for these grants, you have to now, because of COVID, have a contingency plan in case the event delivery format has to change. So you need to put the time into coming up with a plan for what would I do if I couldn't do my event in real life. And your event needs to engage the general public and be delivered either as an in-person event involving physical attendance or an online event involving two-way audience participation. So it can't just be you talking and yelling out into the void of the universe. There needs to be a degree of participation if it's an online event. There's a long list of things that you can't spend money on for National Science Week, but some of the ones that trip people up that I want to draw special attention to are that this particular grant round can't be used for PD for teachers. It can't be used to develop teacher resources and curriculum materials. Really importantly, it can't be used for events that are targeted predominantly at school groups. Now, you could hold an event at a school if it's after hours and it's for the whole community. If you wanted to hold a stargazing event in Nhulunbuy, and the most appropriate place to hold it is on a school oval, and you're going to invite mums and dads and kids and grandmas, that's okay. If you want to run an event for kids, that's okay, but it cannot be at a school during school time for school kids. Really, really important. It will not get funded. You also can't spend the money on capital expenditure, which is buying things that you get to keep, things like video cameras or laptops or cars. Probably not going to buy a car, but you can't buy capital things. And you also can't pay yourself as the grant applicant or presenter for your time. So if I want to take the Sex on the Beach Science Show on the road to Bega and Cooma and Merimbula, unfortunately, I can't pay myself for my time to call up the venues and to write a new show and to present it. However, if someone else applies for a grant, they could pay you to be a presenter because you can pay external presenter fees. So if someone wanted to run an event, if a science communicator was also a swing dancer and they wanted to run a Science of Swing Dancing event, they could not pay themselves to do it. But if the Canberra Swing Cats, a company who runs swing dance classes, was to apply for the grant and then pay that particular science communicator who's also a swing dancer as a presenter, then they can pay them for their time. So that's something we're thinking about. It's not without risks. If you want to encourage or help another person, a local council or an organisation to apply for a grant that you will then be the presenter of, and you want to help them write the grant, you could do that, but you would need to trust that they will use the grant money as you agreed and they'll actually get you to be the presenter, and that things will happen as agreed from there. So it's not without risks, but it is worth thinking about that if you apply for the grant for yourself as the deliverer of a thing, you can't pay yourself for your time. I hope that makes sense. The purpose of National Science Week events are as follows. Your event needs to fit one or more of these purposes. It needs to draw the nation's attention towards science in a quite broad sense, so STEM in that larger universe. It needs to spark interest and engagement in science. It could provide an opportunity for all Australians, including people who are historically underrepresented in the sciences, to participate in science events. It could foster partnerships between communities and research organisations and industry, or it could trial new and innovative science communication activities. So often a National Science Week event will fit more than one of these, but it needs to fit at least one nice and clearly. The assessment criteria have changed a little bit from last year, so I'm glad I did what I was meant to and reread the applications and the instructions before doing this talk. There's actually only 2 criteria now. The first one is about the reach and impact of the project. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, and I won't bore you by reading it out loud, but I'll let you have a read. And the second one is your capacity and capability to carry out the project. So basically, how big and awesome is the project? And can you actually do the project? Those are the 2 things that the grants are assessed on. And the how big and awesome is the project is worth a bit more than can you do it. But this one's pretty important as well. So how can you demonstrate reach and impact? Reach can be measured in a couple of different ways. You could think about the total number of people who are involved. That's usually the first thing that comes to mind when we think about the reach of an event. But you can also think about the number of people involved who are from particular target groups. So groups that are historically underrepresented in the sciences. In previous grant guidelines, they actually listed some of those groups as being women, people with disabilities, people from remote and regional Australia, First Nations people. The specifics have been taken out now. So it's up to you to think about whether your audience might be from a historically underrepresented group in science. And over here, I've put a link to National Science Week's Disability and Inclusion Guide that is worth having a read of. You can also measure impact in a number of different ways. You can think about the emotional goals or the emotional impacts of your event. So how will participants feel? How will they be changed by participating in an event? So maybe stereotypes about science and scientists might be challenged. Maybe participants will grow in confidence. That's one way to look at impact. Another way to look at impact is what participants will actually do. So will they learn something new? Will they learn a skill? Will they make something that they can take away that is useful in their life? The other thing to think about for impact is that the depth of involvement also relates to impact. So someone walking past a market stall and seeing, cool bubbles or cool rocks, it's lovely, but the degree to which they are impacted there is probably much less than someone who participates in a half-day workshop where they work with an expert and they have a really meaningful and personal interaction. So the criteria are about balancing both reach and impact. So you could pitch an event that engages with lots of people a little bit, or you could pitch an event that engages with fewer people, but in a really deep way. And both of those are valid. The other thing in terms of reach and impact, and this relates back to our looking at the ecosystem that you live in, is that I'd really encourage you to find your niche, find the thing that makes your event special, or to create one. So literally lifted from the guidelines, in order to support a spread of projects across Australia and increase accessibility of STEM-related activities, the committee will look at the mixture of events, science disciplines, modes of delivery, organisational distribution, geographic location, proposed target audiences, and barriers addressed when recommending projects for funding. So they will not recommend 30 projects that are all about helping preschool-age kids learn about bugs. They want to have a mixture of events, a mixture of different axes. And one of the best ways to find a niche, to see if your proposed event is going to be different and be something that will fit beautifully into the mix or the mosaic that they're trying to build, is to jump online to the National Science Week website, look for what events were held last year in your area or about your topic, and see if there's lots of them or only a few of them. I asked Jeff Crane very nicely, and he's actually turned it back on. So if you select the dates as August last year, you can look at all the events that were on. Look at the events that were funded. Again, we've got links here. You're welcome to have this later to see the range of events that were successful and see if your event fits its own niche and amongst them. And then do that searching on the National Science Week website to see if you're pitching something that's been pitched a lot before or is a bit different. So for example, I did some data crunching for you as a little bit of an explore. Really, I would super strongly encourage you to think about pitching an event that's going to be held outside of a capital city. There were 52 events in Canberra in 2022 for National Science Week, but there were 0 in Cooma, which is an hour away from Canberra. You could go on a day trip in Cooma and do an event in Cooma. You would get to be the only National Science Week event in Cooma. There was one event near Bega, there was one event in Wagga Wagga, and there was one event in Goulburn. If you imagine the National Science Week committee saying, well, we've got like a whole bunch of events, we've got 20 events pitched in Canberra, we can maybe fund 1 or 2 of them. We've only got 3 or 4 events for the whole of regional New South Wales. If you're one of those events, your chances of getting funded are probably a lot higher. Also, my family's in Townsville. So for funsies, I looked up what events were on in Townsville. There was 0 registered activities in Townsville for National Science Week in 2022. Townsville is a city of 200,000 people. And the really important thing when you're thinking about events is you can hold your event in more than one place. If you want to hold an event in Canberra, that's cool. But if you also tour it, or even tour like a smaller version of it outside of Canberra, I think you've got a much better chance of your funding getting up than just holding something here. Even if you only go a little bit of a way away to Cooma or to Bega or to Merimbula. The beach is nice in Merimbula, go to Merimbula. It's also good to look at the topic or focus of your event. On the National Science Week website, you can sort events by theme. People can categorise their event as having more than one theme. They might say, my event is about health and innovation. But when I did a little bit of a search of events in the Sydney metro area, there were heaps of events that were about the environment and nature, innovation and health, but very, very few events, 35 compared to 3 events that consider themselves to be about mining and industry or maths or archaeology or agriculture. When I've assessed grants, lots of them talk about general science phenomena. I used to work at Questacon. I love Questacon. So I love me some bubbles and some slime. Don't get me wrong. but you often get events like, oh, we're going to do fun, general science activities. That's cool. Bubbles and slime are great, but can you link them to showing off something about Australian scientists? Or can you use those events to engage people outside of the box who you might normally engage with bubbles and slime? If you pitch one of those events, it's going to be really hard to make it stand out. The other one, and this was borne out by my little search in Sydney, is there are lots and lots of events that are pitched about sort of environmental science and biology topics. That's my background. I love it. So it makes me happy, but it's going to make it harder for your event to stand out. So if you do want to run an activity about orchid spotting on Black Mountain, A, sign me up, I will come. But B, you need to write a really, really good grant application, because it's probably not going to be the only idea that is about that general topic. So think about the spread of topics. Can you find a niche? Think about the geography of where you're going to go. Can you find a niche? Think about audience. Can you find a niche? Lots of applications target children and families. Have a think about whether you can target an audience who wouldn't normally attend a science-themed event. If you want to do that, though, it's really important to think about how you're going to sell that event to those people. So if you say, I want to have a swing dancing event that will attract swing dancers, but not scientists, and your only plan for advertising is to put it on the National Science Week page, how many swing dancers are going to see that? Only the very small lump in the Venn diagram who'd like both swing dancing and science. So if you wanted to run a swing dancing event, come up with a plan to promote it through swing dancing communities. If you want to run an event about the physics of cricket and perfecting your bowling with physics, you need to reach out to local sporting organisations. As I said, previous guidelines actually listed out these audiences being the specific groups who are underserved. They're no longer listed in the current guidelines, so it's a little bit up to your interpretation, but I think these are some good audiences to think about. Now jumping into budgets briefly and looking at cash and in-kind contributions. Do your due diligence in doing the best budget you can and making the best estimates you can. Some things like flights are really hard because you can't book your flights yet. So if I want to go to Townsville, I can look at the cost of flights to Townsville now. They might fluctuate a little bit, that's okay. But the part of budgets that people often forget about or don't use to their maximum advantage is the in-kind contributions. They are the things that you are putting in yourself to help this event happen. And one of the biggest ones is your time. As I said, they can't pay for your time to organise the event, so it's an in-kind contribution you're making. I feel like science communicators, including me, I've been victim of this. We have an awful habit of undervaluing our time, of doing things as people for favours, or doing things and charging a really small amount because we want to help a non-profit group, or we want to be nice humans, or it's part of being good members of the science communication community. Stop undervaluing yourselves. When you are looking at the cost of your time, I'm not an expert in how much you should say your time is worth, but at the very least, if organising an event requires a similar level of skills to your day job, think about how much you are paid an hour. And then add a bit to it, because you are doing this in effect as a contractor, as someone who's got to supply your own office and doesn't get sick leave and things like that. So if you are normally paid $30 an hour, for calculating your in-kind contribution, you could say my time is worth $40 an hour. I don't think that's unreasonable at all to add a little bit to it. And then count up the real amount of time you're going to spend to organise this event. As I said, I have never ever heard someone say, wow, that event was quicker to organise than I thought. So when you're looking at your in-kind contributions, value yourself properly and also count up the time of the other people who are going to help you. I needed to count up the time of my sister who was doing graphic design and make sure that she was giving herself enough time to do that work, because I had lots and lots of going back and forward about octopus who are holding handcuffs and exactly what sort of handcuffs they should be holding. The second criteria that you look at for National Science Week is showing that you can do your event. So basically this is about making the assessment panel confident and comfortable that the event is actually going to happen the way you say it's going to happen. And when you're doing that, think about all of your skills. You don't just need the skills to talk on a stage and do a cool cabaret show or to do a hands-on activity with preschoolers. You also need skills to do promotion, to do evaluation of your event, to do graphic design for your event. to do logistics planning of transporting stuff. And if you don't have those skills, find someone who does. One of the best ways to reassure the grant assessor that this event is going to work is to show that you've done some informal market research to see that the event has appeal. Ask the local swing dancing community on Facebook on their groups, hey, would you come to a Science of Swing Dancing event? And if you say, well, I did a poll on Facebook and 75 people of the 100 members said they'd totally come, that's awesome. That's an indication that you've actually seen if your event has appeal. And even better, do a trial or a test of your activity and gather some feedback, even if it's on a smaller scale. I think a really good thing that you can look at doing is to apply for a seed grant for National Science Week. So do a small version of your event one year, do some really good evaluation, and then the following year, apply for a National Science Week grant and say, well, last year I ran my event and 95% of people said they learned something new and it was a sellout and they had a ball, and now I want to make it bigger. And that will reassure people that you've done your due diligence and it's an event that's likely to work. You can also show that your planning is underway. So reach out to venues and ask them for in-principle support. Say, yep, I've spoken to these organisations. They would be very happy to host me if we get there. All of those things will reassure the organisers that you're on top of things and the event's going to work. The other thing that's really important with capability and capacity is you don't have to be an island. You don't have to do everything on your own. If you don't have expertise in something, doesn't make you a bad person. It's just that individual humans can't be good at everything and can't have known everything and practiced everything. So find someone who does know about that thing and get them to help you. This is especially important if you want to work with communities who you don't identify as being part of yourself or who you haven't worked with a lot in the past. So while it's great to target an underrepresented audience, if that's not an audience you're familiar with working with, that could be a real challenge and it can have risks. A good example here, I think, is the Sex on the Beach science show that I did last year. I actually originally wrote 10 years ago as an Adults on the Night at Questacon. And our language about gender has evolved a lot in 10 years. Our language about sexuality has changed a little bit, but for gender, it's changed a lot. And I was really conscious in wanting to do this show again, that I wanted to make some tweaks to the show to make sure that it was really, really inclusive of people with diverse gender identities. It's not something I'm an expert at. I'm not part of the LGBTQI community. So I reached out to someone who was both a science communicator and part of that community. I actually ended up having two people who very, very kindly and generously helped to review my show and make sure that the content and the language I was using was inclusive. That was hugely valuable, both for me to feel confident doing the show, and I actually got feedback after the show that said, oh, wow, your language was really inclusive. The way that you dealt with gender was done in a really gentle and subtle and inclusive and joyful way. So thank you. So don't feel like you have to be the only person who knows everything. Go to the trouble of finding the right people to help you. Finally, in wrapping up, if you decide this grant round isn't for you, or if you apply for the grant and heaven forbid you don't get it, roughly speaking, the number of grants varies every year, but only about a third of National Science Week grants get funding in a good year. Sometimes it's more like a quarter. So if you don't get funded, it doesn't mean your event was necessarily terrible. It just means it was really competitive. There are other ways that you can get funding as well. You can look at state and territory governments. You could look at local councils. Inspiring Australia also offer grants for events that are outside of National Science Week. And as I mentioned before, state and territories also have seed grants or smaller grants for National Science Week, that should say, sorry, not ESWK, that was a typo. They're usually up to $2,000, or very occasionally they're up to $5,000 if they're for an event for a very specific target audience. So there are lots and lots of different grants available. But again, don't just copy your application from one into another. Please make sure you answer the actual questions that you are being asked. But do think laterally. You might see a grant for the local council or for the ACT government that's talking about placemaking, making spaces welcoming and vibrant, or about engaging young people. You could do a science event that helps to do those things. So think a bit laterally about whether you can fit your event or the heart of your event, if not the whole of the event, into some of those other grant areas. That's plenty of me talking. I guess, are there any questions? Jill, I might let you sort of manage the asking of questions, but thank you all so much for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Alice. That was fantastic. We have had some questions come through in the chat. Some I've sort of answered as we've been going, but we did have one that I was going to put to you. Is there a preference for local events / online events / competitions, or all equal preference?
My understanding is they want a balanced program. So a mixture. I would pick the thing that you think you can do the best job of and put your best foot forward. There is definitely an appeal to online events and that people can do them anywhere, but it's also great to have some events in real life. So I would pick the most appropriate delivery format for what you're hoping to do and put it forward that way. But as they said, you do need a plan B. So if it's an in real life event, having a plan B for if, heaven forbid, COVID 7.5.3.4 comes back is really important.
If anyone else has any other questions, so someone's come through. Obviously, you said it's great to make your excitement come through. Speaking into more formal context, such as government grants, is it better to be short and concise, almost like a technical report, or be more creative and descriptive? This is a film rather than an event we're trying to find funding for.
First of all, look at the word limit. So if you're allowed to write up to 200 words, they will happily read 200 words. Be clear. So I wouldn't use lots of jargon and waffle, but that's not the same as not showing your excitement. I think that you need to use professional language, but don't feel like you have to write it like a government or a research report. You are trying to capture people's imagination, and ultimately these events are about exciting the community about science. So if you write a really dry and boring proposal, I, as the assessor, are going to go, oh no, does that mean they're going to run a really dry and boring event? So I think have some personality and have some enthusiasm, but do still think about the context that these are going to be events that are funded by government eventually. I hope that's a bit of a halfway answer, but I would a little bit more on the excitement end than on the super duper dry formal government end for these sorts of grants for National Science Week.
A little bit of specifics about how many sessions you're running and things like that are also useful. So to say, if Alice just put in saying, I'm going to run a science show, you're like, cool. How many, what sort of event, like what sort of venue, that sort of detail. We don't need to know super detail, but that sort of detail. Someone did ask say that they'll be looking at state grants for schools next year. Most of the National Science Week grants that come from the Inspiring Australia committees are again the same as national. They will not go to events that are for school groups. The Australian Science Teachers Association runs a grant round for schools. So if you want to run an event for your Year 5 group, to get a cool scientist in to talk about STEM in National Science Week, look at the Australian Science Teachers Association. They run grants specifically for schools. So that's who you go to for that. Another question was, where can we see an example successful grant proposal?
You can see the list of successful grants on one of the slides. I put in a bunch of links. Jill, I'm very happy if you want to
I have posted those links in the chat as we've been going as well.
In terms of a whole successful proposal, you could email and ask if they would be willing to share a whole proposal, but that would be up to the National Science Week Committee whether they're willing to do that, and I'm not sure if they would. But you will get a very strong feeling for how they've positioned their events by reading the blurbs for the successful events online.
I don't know about other states, but for the ACT, we actually, in our information about our state-based grants, we actually give you an example application. So it's not one that we've received, it's one that the people who do the assessment of the grants have written as something that they would consider a successful grant application. So some of the other states may have that. The national, did you look to see if the national science?
The national ones have the form that shows you what each of the questions is, but they don't have any. And years gone by, I swear they did. I swear they had a pretend one that was good, but I could not find one now.
But
so there's one thing I forgot, Jill, really briefly, but really importantly, the system that you put your National Science Week grant into is a clunky pain in the bum. So give yourself plenty of time to submit it and keep clicking save. It has a bad habit of chucking people off it. especially because 90% of people will try to put their application in the afternoon that it's due. So try to do it ahead of time. But sorry, the one other thing I should have said is it is unfortunately quite clunky and quite moody. So keep clicking save, and I would strongly encourage you to write all of your responses in a Word document and copy paste them over, because you may lose them, which can be a bit heartbreaking.
There's another question here. Risk-wise, is it better to undersell and over-deliver or optimistically oversell your event to justify the cost?
I would sell it honestly. So I would say, honestly, what do I think I can achieve? And I think I can achieve that because I did my research. So I did a test and I found it worked, or I did some some reaching out on Facebook or other groups and people said they were interested. So I would rather people give their best honest estimate of what's going to happen. Obviously, you can't control everything. Things might not go